She had forgotten almost everything, but she had not forgotten that night. That's the thing about the brain that nobody tells you until you need to know it. The emotional memories go last. The facts dissolve first. The names, the dates, the sequence of things, the practical architecture of a life, but the feelings stay. The moments that were saturated with feeling, that were so fully lived that they got stored somewhere deeper than ordinary memory, those stay long after everything else has gone. Margaret Holloway was 81 years old. She had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's 3 years earlier. She could no longer reliably tell you what year it was or the name of the president or sometimes the name of her daughter who drove her everywhere and whose face she knew even when she had temporarily lost the word for what that face meant to her. But she could tell you about the night she saw Diane Keaton in her first film. She could tell you everything about that night. The late show that Wednesday had been running with the warm, easy energy that Diane Keaton always produced in rooms. She was 78 years old and had long ago stopped performing herself for anyone, which meant that what you got when you got Diane Keaton was simply Diane Keaton, unmediated and entirely worth it. She was funny in the sharp, self-deprecating way of someone who has spent 50 years in the public eye and found the whole thing consistently absurd. The audience loved her immediately. Stephen was good that night. The conversation moved through her career with the pleasure of two people who both find the subject genuinely interesting. She talked about the early years, about the work, about what it meant to look back on 50 years of films and see not a career but something more like an argument, a long, ongoing argument about what women were allowed to be on screen. And then Stephen said he had someone he wanted her to meet. Diane looked at him with the particular expression she had, slightly suspicious, slightly amused, the expression of someone who has been surprised enough times to be permanently prepared for it. Someone who knew you, Stephen said, a long time ago. I've known a lot of people a long time ago, Diane said. Not like this, Stephen said. The side door opened. Margaret Holloway walked in slowly, with the careful steps of someone navigating a world that has become slightly less reliable than it used to be. Her daughter walked beside her, one hand lightly at her elbow, not guiding, just present. Margaret was small, white-haired, wearing a blue cardigan that her daughter had told her was her favorite color. She looked at the studio with mild, interested eyes, taking it in without urgency, the way she took in most things now. She looked at Diane Keaton. And something happened in her face. Not recognition exactly, or not only recognition, something older than recognition, something that lives below the level where Alzheimer's reaches. Oh, Margaret said softly, just that, just the sound of something arriving that had been expected for a very long time. Diane stood up. She looked at this small, white-haired woman who was looking at her with an expression she couldn't name and had never seen directed at her before, not fan recognition, not celebrity excitement, something more private than either of those things. Hello, Diane said carefully. Hello, Margaret said, and then with the complete certainty of someone stating a fact, I saw you the first time. Subscribe and leave a comment, because what Margaret remembered about that night and what it did to Diane Keaton is the part that stopped the entire studio. Stephen had arranged chairs, not the formal desk setup, but two chairs facing each other close, the way you arrange things when you want two people to actually be with each other rather than performing for a room. Diane and Margaret sat. Margaret's daughter sat just behind her mother, close enough to help if help was needed. Tell me, Diane said. Her voice was different, stripped of the wit and the self-deprecation and the 50-year armor of someone who has been famous long enough to know how to be famous. Just a woman asking another woman to tell her something. Margaret looked at her hands for a moment, then looked up. It was 1970, she said. Her voice was clear and steady in the way that voices are sometimes clear and steady when they are accessing something stored in a deeper place than ordinary speech. I was 28 years old. I had 2 children at home and a husband who didn't understand why I needed to go to the movies by myself sometimes. A slight smile. I went anyway. Diane was very still. The theater was on Wilshire, Margaret continued. I remember the smell of it, that particular smell of old carpet and popcorn that movie theaters had then. I remember I had a coffee in a paper cup that was too hot to hold properly, so I kept switching it from hand to hand. She paused, the pause of someone checking that the memory is still there, still intact, still reliable. And then you came on screen. What film? Diane asked quietly. Does it matter? Margaret said, not unkindly, just honestly. Diane shook her head slightly. No, I suppose it doesn't. You came on screen, Margaret said, and you did something. I don't know exactly what it was. You moved in a certain way, or you looked at something in a certain way. I don't remember the scene. I just remember thinking, she's not performing, she's just being. and I had never seen a woman on screen just be before, not like that. The studio was completely silent. I started crying, Margaret said simply. In the dark by myself holding a paper cup of coffee that was still too hot. I didn't know why I was crying, I just knew that something I had been waiting for without knowing I was waiting had arrived. She looked at Diane directly. You made me feel like it was allowed to just be, whatever I was, however I was, it was allowed. Diane Keaton was crying. Not the polished tears of a practiced performer, but the real ones, the kind that arrive when something reaches past every layer of professional composure and lands directly in the place where the true things live. Her hands were in her lap and they were not still, and she was not trying to make them still. I've thought about that night so many times, Margaret said. Her voice was quieter now, slightly more careful, the voice of someone who has learned to be careful with the things that still remain. My daughter tells me I forget things. I know I forget things. I can see it happening sometimes, like watching something go around a corner. There and then not there, she paused. But I have not forgotten that night. I have not forgotten you on that screen and the feeling of something being allowed. She looked at Diane steadily. I wanted you to know that before I forget that too. The last sentence landed in the studio like something irreversible. Before I forget that too. Diane reached out and took Margaret's hands in both of hers. She held them the way you hold things you understand are temporary, fully, carefully, with the awareness that the holding matters precisely because it cannot last forever. Thank you, Diane said, her voice was barely above a whisper, for coming here, for telling me. Margaret looked at their joined hands, then up at Diane. You look the same, she said. In person, you look the same as you did on that screen. Diane laughed, the surprised laugh that lives right next to tears. I absolutely do not. You do to me, Margaret said simply. And the simplicity of it, the complete absence of performance in it, made it the truest thing anyone had said in that studio all night. This is the moment nobody in the studio and nobody watching at home ever saw coming. Stephen had not moved from his chair. He had been watching the two women with the expression of a man who has spent 20 years on television and has just witnessed something that made all 20 years feel like preparation for this specific Wednesday night. He looked at Margaret's daughter, who was sitting behind her mother with tears streaming quietly down her face, one hand pressed against her mouth. How long has she been talking about this night? Stephen asked her gently. Margaret's daughter took a breath. Since I was a child, she said. She told me about it when I was maybe 7 or 8. She said it was one of the most important nights of her life. She said a woman on a movie screen showed her something she needed to see. She looked at her mother. She's told me that story her whole life. It's one of the ones she still has. Diane was looking at Margaret with an expression that had no name in ordinary language, the expression of someone learning, late and suddenly, what their work had actually been for. I didn't know, Diane said, to no one in particular, to the room, to the 50 years of films and roles and choices made in the dark. I never knew. Margaret squeezed Diane's hands, the firm, deliberate squeeze of someone making sure the other person receives what is being communicated. Now you know, she said. After the tapping, Diane sat with Margaret and her daughter in the green room for 40 minutes. They looked at photographs on Margaret's daughter's phone, Margaret at 28. The year she had sat alone in a theater on Wilshire with a cup of coffee that was too hot. Diane held the phone carefully and looked at the young woman in the photograph, dark-haired, serious, standing in a backyard somewhere with the expression of someone who was waiting, without knowing it, for something to be allowed. Before they left, Margaret turned in the doorway and looked at Diane. I'll probably forget this, she said. The calm, matter-of-fact calm of someone who has made peace with something that cannot be changed. Tomorrow or next week or next month I'll probably forget I was here. Diane looked at her. But you'll remember the feeling, Diane said. Even when you forget the rest, you'll remember the feeling. Margaret considered this, then nodded once, satisfied. Yes, she said, I think I will. She left. Diane stood in the doorway of the green room for a long moment after the elevator closed. The studio was emptying around her, the crew breaking down, the lights going off in sequence, the ordinary machinery of ending a night of television. She thought about a woman alone in a dark theater in 1970, holding a cup of coffee that was too hot, crying without knowing why. She thought about being 24 years old and standing in front of a camera and not performing, just being, whatever that meant, however that looked, and not knowing that someone in the dark was watching and feeling something become allowed. Some things you do without knowing what they're for. Some rooms you fill without knowing who is sitting in them. Some performances reach somewhere you will never see, change something you will never know about, give permission for something that needed permission and found it, unexpectedly, in a darkened theater on Wilshire Boulevard in 1970. Margaret Holloway forgot that she had been to the Late Show within 3 weeks. Her daughter told her about it and she listened politely and said it sounded nice. But sometimes, in the evenings, she would look at a particular photograph on her daughter's phone, herself and Diane Keaton, hands clasped in a green room in New York, and something would move across her face. Not recognition, something older than recognition. The feeling of something being allowed. That doesn't go, that never goes. If this story moved you, like this video and subscribe, because some moments stay with us long after we forget everything else.